Hello everyone, Luca Blight here with a hopefully quick video. I just want to discuss a common argument I've heard against RWBY lately, and that has to do with Volume 5. So, if you have not seen up to Episode 6 yet, get off this because I'm going to spoil it a bit. I won't get into too many details, but spoiler warning up front. So, the argument is that Volume 5 hasn't had enough action. It needs more action because, let's be realistic here, RWBY got famous based more on the character designs and the fights said characters had, as opposed to its story and plot. That has kind of sort of flipped topsy-turvy, where it's more story-driven. The story is the more prominent aspect, as opposed to the fights in, volumes 1 and 2, and to a lesser extent 3. Because 3 is when the real change was starting to go on, because we actually had a plot going into it. That's not to say I didn't enjoy the little bits and bobs we had in volumes 1 and 2, but when you look at them, they are arcs within a single arc themselves, within an arc. So you have a bunch of little arcs, 3 sub-arcs, and then the overarching arc. How many times can I say arc in a sentence? But if you look at volume 1, initially it's just RWBY joining the academy, meeting everybody. They go and do their whole training thing. Then it's the Jaune arc. And then it's just a bunch of stuff that really had nothing to do with the previous two tidbits, because I might get a little ahead of myself here. I might come back to this point. But Penny and Sun had no business being at Volume 1. None. I felt like it was a disservice to their characters and an overall disservice to... what I will say, as much as I liked Volume 1, it should have ended with that fight in Episode 8, where it was Juniper and RWBY taking on the two giant Grimm, and then I think it was... Celtic Productions said that they should have had the snake one, the King Taijutsu, I think it's called, something like that. I want to say it was him that said that, but essentially it was the three big Grimm versus the teams, and I think he would have like Carden and them in there and whatnot. I could go either way with Carden being involved, because ultimately Carden, past Volume 1, Carden was inconsequential to the overall story. So for me, Season 1 should have been basically a introductory to the world arc, which, to be fair, it was, but it should have been more... It should have ended with that fight instead of all the stuff that came after. And they could have had Jaune's arc before that. So basically you would have the introduction, them going through their classes, their routines, then you have the Jaune arc, where Jaune gets his confidence. And then in that fight, in Episode 8, is where he gets to show that he has gained said confidence, and he becomes ultimately a leader alongside RWBY. Like, he picks up his own leadership traits and whatnot from RWBY. He sees inspiration in her. That way, Jaune isn't taken away from RWBY's team, and RWBY is actually benefiting off of Jaune's built-up in confidence, because she is ultimately the catalyst to that. And then back to Sun and Penny, as I said, they should have been introduced at the beginning of Volume 2. Sun in particular, because of what ultimately that volume went into. And there is some relevance to all I'm saying. I'm not giving you guys like a full-blown recap. There is a point that I'm going to get to here. It might take me a little bit, though. But Sun should have been introduced at the beginning, and you could have had the whole dynamic between Weiss, Sun, and Blake, where essentially you would have Weiss be kind of a bitch to Sun, but she would warm up to him because he doesn't like the White Fang, and he's against it. And it shows that Weiss isn't a complete and utter racist, which she was shown to be. I made arguments with people over this, but I can't really deny that she was pretty damn bad in Volume 1, and they kind of just scrapped it completely in Volume 2, which it's not terrible, because ultimately it didn't amount to anything. But still, it could have been something that kept conflict going on between Blake and Weiss, and that should have been what built up through Volume 2, where you had Weiss and Blake going at each other, and Blake going out of her way to prove to Weiss that, hey, I'm not all these things you say I am, and I'm going to prove it to you. And ultimately, Weiss, being not as bad as we think she is, does decide to help, Blake, RWBY, and Yang take out the White Fang and all that stuff. And they should have kept going with it. They had it to where they think they stopped them, or they attacked Roman and ran him off, and then they just kind of stopped. I always thought that was weird in Volume 2. They just stopped. But they didn't... okay, they didn't particularly stop, because I just remember the whole Yang and Blake moment where Blake's like, they're still out there. Yang's like, take a breather, we'll get them. And ultimately, they did end up going after them again, but you had that dance in between, so it kind of threw the pacing off a little. I could be getting nitpicky here, but that's just kind of how I feel. Let's see, what else? Oh, yeah, back to Volume 1 real quick. I completely skipped over this, but the end fight with Roman, Blake, Sun, Penny, and RWBY made RWBY look weak. Another reason why I didn't particularly care for the ending of Volume 1. Especially since it did not have the four main girls working together, which is what Volume 1 was building up to. Because Yang and Weiss were absentee in that whole final segment, which is, again, why I think that episode, or that fight in Episode 8 should have been the big climactic fight, because that had more going on with it than all the stuff we got after. And then, again, the Sun and Blake bits would have fit better in Volume 2, where the White Fang were the main relevant threat. You keep Volume 1 as just, Roman's out there doing his shenanigans, and you maybe have him pop up here and there just to add a kind of aura of mystery of like, what's this dude up to? What is his goal? What is his end game? And then, of course, you have RWBY and them focusing more on training and getting the experience they need to actually be able to do stuff like this. And then the White Fang, who honestly has been portrayed as kind of the disposable stormtrooper type group, because I think there have been more dead faunus in this show than there have been dead humans. So they should have been treated as more of a viable threat, which ultimately they weren't. But now in Volume 5, they kind of are being treated that way. So, give me 1 second. Okay, and then we move on to Volume 3, which I'm going to quickly just kind of skip over, because Volume 3, by and large, start to finish, I was okay with pretty much all of it. The tournament itself was a bit lacking, but ultimately that wasn't the main part of the story. It was just a plot device to get to the ending, because it had been built up as this big deal. It came, it did what it needed to do. They could have done more with it, but ultimately they didn't. But what we got was workable. It was pretty much bar minimum the most acceptable it could have been without too much, negativity drawn towards it. So could have been better, but it was okay for what it was. Now I'm going to get into the main point, which is, as I said, Volume 3 was kind of the turning point where it became more of a story-driven show and less of, a fun time, fight scenes everywhere, that type of stuff. And this is what I want people to, whenever they make the argument of, there's not enough fight scenes in RWBY, is that each of the fights in Volume 4 had a purpose for existing. If you look at the fights in Volume 1, some of them didn't. Volume 2, I think actually all of them did. But we didn't get that many in Volume 2, if I'm remembering quickly, because we only had, you could say the food fight, but that one was that was for shits and giggles and fun. You had that one in the I think it was Episode 4, between the four girls and Roman, where Neo comes in and saves her. And then after that, it becomes more of a spy-esque type thing with Cinder shenanigans. And then you had, of course, the fight at the end, which, again, the main girls had their steam stolen from them by a bunch of side characters that we haven't seen in 2 volumes. But in the end, Volume 3 kind of sort of amended that, because it was everybody working together. Like, nobody was trying to outshine anybody else. And, in the end, the bad guys pretty much won, which is good for building up your first big arc, because now we have a viable threat to struggle against. So back to my main point with the fights having meaning. The opener between Ranger and the Geist established that Team Ranger could work together, that they were compatible, that they could get the job done against, not an imposing threat. You move on to Episode 3 with Blake and Sun against the Grimm. That one to me felt mostly like a fun go-around, but it did kind of show that Sun was there for Blake when she needed him. Because she was struggling, she wasn't winning, he comes in, and together they're able to take down the dragon. So I think that was what was implied. I could just be pulling that out of my ass, but that's what I took away from that fight. But if you want to argue that that one was just for funsies, I can give that to you as well. The Tyrion fight was probably the most plot-centric fight in the entire thing, because it led to Crow's exposition in regards to the looming threat that is Salem. And he had to give that explanation to Ranger because, well, they need to know who the hell this Tyrion guy was and why he just showed up out of nowhere and tried to take RWBY and try to kill the rest of the team. I need to take breaths in between my points. But ultimately, that fight led to the exposition, as I said, of Ranger kind of getting filled in on the main plot, at least the main points, that there are two gods, one of destruction, one of creation. one of the gods made the Grimm, and Salem is now in charge of the Grimm and is trying to get the relics, which were poorly introduced. They should have been introduced in Volume 3. Maybe not necessarily the tie-in between the Maiden and the relics. The relics just kind of came out of nowhere. And it was basically another MacGuffin that we have to worry about between the Maidens and stuff like that. But Volume 5 fixed that with the explanation that the Maidens are needed to access the relics, because now it makes sense why Salem is after the Maidens, because in order to get to the relics, I need to get to the Maidens. I think it was one of the videos that Celtic Productions and Fat Man Falling did, where they basically mounted them as gatekeepers, which, yeah, but at least they're relevant to the plot. I mean, I take a lot of what they say, I wouldn't say to heart, but a lot of what they say does make sense. But I have seen that Fat Man Falling in particular gets very nitpicky, very negative, almost as if he doesn't want to like the show. That might not be the case at all, but I do get that feeling that sometimes it's like, okay, dude, come on, give the showrunners a break. They've improved. They've gotten better. Yes, this show has many flaws, but people are still able to enjoy it for what it is. And hey, more power to you. And if you don't like the show, hey, you don't like the show. That said, you are completely entitled to have an opinion, be it negative or positive. I just happen to disagree with some of what Fat Man Falling has been saying lately, because this volume to me has mended a lot of the damage that Volume 4 did. And that's not to say Volume 4 was bad. It's just, it was all over the place, and they were kind of experimenting with, the whole multiple plot lines. But anyways, I'm getting off track here. So the Tyrion fight again led to that big exposition of the real threat, that is Salem. And then the end fight, which, while good, could have been so much better, because what it should have been more about Ren and his struggle against his inability to do anything when his father and mother were killed, and when that Nukkalavi wiped everybody out in the town that he had known. Like all of his childhood friends, if he had any, were dead. Anybody else he knew, dead. All because this one Grimm decided to trot in and kill everybody. But they didn't really hit on that much. They made it more about Jaune, which is not a bad thing, but Ren should have been the main focal point. And I remember saying this in a couple of videos here and there. I think I said on a discussion as well, is that it should have been Ren was both the hindrance and the one that needed to overcome the obstacle, because it should have been Ren doing all this reckless stuff, just angrily attacking it, not working well with range, which had been established in episode 1, but it was showing that the most calm one was now the most angry one, and so it's kind of like a flippant dynamics, where Ren used to be the competent fighter, Jaune was the incompetent sort of fighter, but now it's kind of flip-flopped, where Ren's acting reckless, and Jaune's like, Ren, you need to calm your shit down, dude, like, we're dying out here because you keep almost getting killed, and what ultimately ends up causing him to come back to it is, of course, what happens in the fight itself. But that's where the problem started. It's like, oh, Rooster Teeth figured out how to, or not Rooster Teeth, but Mouse and Carrie, same thing, found a viable plot point. The problem was, the fight was already 2/3 done, and the conclusion was kind of weak. It was built up, and then it just kind of fell on its face. Because the way they ultimately beat it seemed strange, and it felt like there was a story that should have been told, but wasn't told correctly. And that is Ren basically struggling with himself. Because the Nukkalavi is just supposed to be the entertaining part and the physical embodiment of Ren's, pent-up aggression towards his own inability to take action. So ultimately, they had the potential to make something amazing, but they settled for just making it good. That's just my opinion. You can disagree if you like. What else? Oh yeah, so on to Volume 5, where it's been a lot of build-up, and to me, this can go one way or it can go the other, just like that fight that Ren had with the Nukkalavi. It can be build up to something great and fall completely on its ass, or it can build up to something great and still be great. With episode 7 coming out in a few days, I think ultimately we will get Blake and Sun versus Illia, ending with the White Fang assassins marching upon Giran Kali's home, or the Belladonna home. And then episode 8 will get more of that. So 7 and 8 will be our centerpiece action for the mid-season, if you will. I hope they don't pull a Walking Dead and do a mid-season finale. That would annoy me greatly, because I hate that The Walking Dead does that. But if they're going off the formula of Volume 4, with episode 6 and 7 being very action-centric, they could pull it off here with the White Fang, Gira, and Kali, and all them. The problem, of course, is that the Grimm are the main threat, but we haven't seen much of the Grimm in this volume. We've only seen the Lancer Grimm, which not a bad thing, but not a particularly great thing, because the Grimm are ultimately the main villains. They should be the more prominent ones around. But the Grimm, have they really been given a chance to show how imposing and threatening they are? Because it seems like they get steamrolled every time they pop up. The Knuckle, you could argue, gave them a fight because it disarmed all 4 of them at one point and knocked out 2 of their R's, but ultimately it didn't kill anybody. In fact, the only on-screen Grimm death we've gotten was Roman's, and then the faceless people from the ship. Like, we heard voices, we knew people died, but we didn't see who they were, so we couldn't really relate to them. So it was, like I said in my reaction, like, ooh, that's dark, like we're actually seeing Grimm kill people, but it wasn't enough, if you will. But that said, this has been a more plot-driven story as opposed to volumes 1, 2, and 3, where it was more action-centric and it was more stylish, more flashy. And here it's kind of settled down. It's more artistic, it's more colorful, but it's not as flashy. And that's not a bad thing if they pull it off in the right way at the end, or at the end of the volume. Now, if episode 7 doesn't have any kind of action at all, I'm going to kind of lean towards in favor of those saying, all right, we're not getting enough action because we're 7 episodes in. We should have had something happen. There should have been a payoff to one of these plot lines going on, which there is one good thing that's coming of this so far that I could say for certain will be a good thing in the long run, and that is all of our main characters coming back together. Because we've gotten 3 of the 4 main girls reunited. Now it's time for Blake and Sun to have their excuse to leave Menagerie, which we will get when the White Fang comes and wrecks the Belladonna home. To me, that's where I think they're going with this, and I hope that's where they're going with this, because yes, you do need to have some kind of payoff. The people arguing for more action do have a point there, but at the same time, I will still defend the show's more slower paced progression, because it is ultimately giving us world building, more character exposition, more explanation, and we got, we actually got growth from RWBY for like the first time in the entire series. So I'm actually giving a reason to see RWBY as, a human being, as opposed to before where she was just kind of there. She was one-dimensional. Not to say I didn't like her, it's just I should be liking her more than I currently am. But right now, I'm liking her a bit more. Volume 4, the end of Volume 4 was a turning point, and so far throughout Volume 5, I've only grown to like her that much more. Yang has always been my favorite. Weiss took a bit of growing on me, and then Blake, I'm still on the fence with Blake. I really don't know about Blake. I don't dislike Blake, but I don't really have much of a reason to like her. But as far as the other 3 members of Team Ranger, been liking them since the start of the show. Jaune, I think, took a little bit to grow on me, but I think throughout Volume 3, he really grew on me. In Volume 4, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm totally behind Jaune. But the point I also want to convey to those wanting more action scenes is that the action has to have a meaning behind it, as I listed all the fights in Volume 4 having a plot point reason for existing. Blake versus Illia has a place, and it has a point to exist in the plot, because ultimately Illia is being told by Ballsack and Fiddlestick, as I like to call them, to keep Blake away from the Belladonna home, because they don't want Blake getting in the way, because Adam wants Blake alive. And, so if she's out of the way, if Illia can keep her distracted long enough for everybody else to get, slaughtered, then we'll have, a reason for a fight to occur. And to be fair to Illia, because a lot of people are like, Illia, you traitor, and all that sort of stuff, which, yeah, to be fair. But she's not going to be the one that's going to end up killing Gira and Kali. It's probably going to be like Yuma or something like that. Or Yuma and the Ginyu forces of the White Fang or some nonsense. I really hope we don't get like a Ginyu force in the White Fang. That would just be nonsensical and silly. So, putting all that together, I see both sides of the argument. But ultimately, what really will determine if the show is doing right by itself or not is what the payoff ends up being based upon all this buildup. And if it goes the right way, which I think it's going towards that, it's definitely building up to something big. And we are, without a doubt, going to get some big, epic showdown at the end of this volume. May not be, the Battle of Haven. I think they're saving that for Volume 6, which will be the end of the Haven arc. Or at least I expect it to be the end of the Haven arc. But we'll get something in between. You just have to be patient with the show and understand that they are changing the pacing so that they can tell a more coherent and easier to put together story. Because when Volume 4 released on DVD, you could watch it as a formatted movie, and the volume suddenly made a lot more sense, and it fit more well together as opposed to being episodic. And I think that's how they're writing the show. It's once Volume 5 is released on DVD/Blu-ray, if you watch it like a movie, everything will fit together perfectly, or as perfectly as it can with what was done with it. Alright, so I managed to get this in 20 minutes. I was hoping to get it in like 15, but I got sidetracked a lot of stuff. But ultimately, that's the point I'm trying to convey, is that if action is going to exist, it has to exist for a plot-driven reason, because this is now a plot-driven show. So if you skipped all the way to the end just to hear that remark, that is pretty much my entire argument here, is that I get why people want more action. I understand it. I feel the same way. But at the same time, I get why they're not doing it as much as they did in Volumes 1, 2, and 3. Because we have an actual plot to work with. But that's my thoughts. Let me know what you think down below, and I shall see you all for whatever video I upload next.